Welcome to episode 4 of Modular podcast. The topic for this month is random, and who better than someone that's just released a module, random sampling, Mark Verbos. Are you all right, Mark?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, I sort of like to think of you as master of random. Those ideas.
What a title!
Get a T-shirt made for you. Master of random. And of course we've got Greg and Matthew. Greg, are you alright?
Not too bad, Ben. How are you?
Yeah.
Good to see.
And Matthew, I come to you last because I think if Mark's the master of random, you're the one that's got the issue that needs to go speak to people about random.
Yeah. There's specialist people I can go and see about this, you know.
Especially council-funded self-help groups for random.
Yeah.
So yeah, we sometimes talk about what modules we're using at the minute, but as we've got Mark, let's get straight into random. Should we kick off with some of our favourite things to do with random in general? Does anyone want to offer a patch example or a use of sample and hold or other random sources?
Yeah, Matthew.
No, well, yeah. I mean, the one that I think just stand out at the moment, just because it's a relatively new purchase, is the Qubit NanoRand, and just a little 4 HP module. It's great. It's got like 4 different switchable algorithms of different random modes, and you've got a random clock output which is derived from the internal clock or an external clock in, but is a musical division of that clock. So it can be like 16th note, etc., and it will randomly swap around between that, and it's really neat, is that? So that can obviously be sent around your system, pinning different things, but it's always it's random, but it's based on the internal or external clock coming into it. So it's kind of super useful. That's what I've been having a lot of fun with recently.
Does it?
My kind of thing is that kind of random that's based on a clock coming into it. I mean,
yeah.
The way I use random in my system is in subtle amounts because of the type of music that I make. But
yeah.
For 4 HP, that sounds really interesting.
It really is. It's just a neat little module, and I think you particularly like it, Greg, for that kind of thing. I mean, the kind of music I make isn't particularly beat orientated, but I like these musical divisions that it can actually be useful. But that's what's really good about, and I'm sure we'll touch onto it, within this subject of random generation of stuff, is that it can apply to basically any genre of music that you're into. That randomness can be applied to just about anything, really.
An important thing about the story, I think, is that there are several different disciplines, if you will, in the world of random. You have the kind that are independently moving around voltages. You have ones that are renewed with pulses, which generally are thought of as coming for each new note. There's a new held random value, and then you also have ones that can be in the audio range, like types of noise, and I'm sure that there are others I'm overlooking. But in that case, generally I think the music that isn't as rhythmic or is more ambient benefits more from the kind that are just wavering around, flowing in the breeze, rather than updated note by note. And maybe you disagree with that, but
no, totally. I think, yeah, again, I think that's a really good way of putting it, that you can have this kind of I mean, pseudo-random's its own thing, but just this, how you can apply those different things like that, having it completely wide open. Or as you said, like every time another note comes round, then there's something that's generated again, So it's just so much scope within this field for creativity, I think.
Well, I think if you're, even like you said, something that's just completely fluctuating, not influenced by anything else, I mean, you've only got to run it through another sample and hold to grab a value anyway, or general CV utility stuff like having a slew, offset attenuation and slew in something like a Manhattan analog CVP, or, well, there's loads of slews. But you could take even a random gate with a really heavy slew and just get odd, out-of-time fluctuating stuff that it might just be a slight attenuated amount on a wave folder or a filter or pulse width modulation, or I think you can still apply it within a structured musical in time framework, if you like.
Yeah.
You've just got to have the sort of CV utilities to do it. So it's not firing off like a snare drum that's completely out of time with a kick and a hi-hat.
Exactly.
You know,
I guess now is as good a time as any to sort of, for me, to talk about the history of this stuff, because you might say that I'm the master of random, but as far as I'm concerned, the godfather of the random module in a synthesizer in general is Don Buchla, and he did a lot of research to come to these different categories and essentially invent each of these ideas. So one of the things that I brought to this chat was that I brought some of the original Buchla modules that did these things. So first one is a Buchla 265, which came out in 1970, and this is where the so-called random voltage outputs with probable rate of change, which ultimately we started calling fluctuating randoms. This is where it first appeared. So this is where inside of this module, it's taking a noisy triangle wave and from an internally CV-controlled clock, it's using a sample and hold to grab from that noisy triangle and then low-pass filter it in correlation with the speed of the oscillator. This is a really cool thing because it allows a kind of perceived change in movement, but it's still random that's happening. And because he used a triangle wave that's synced to noise rather than just noise, it actually has an equal distribution of all throughout the voltage range.
Right.
So that's a pretty cool thing. And then he also here did the stored random voltage outs, which are actually sample and holds following that same noisy triangle with a pulse input instead of an internal clock. And that's where the first, well, not quite the first time that ever appeared, because the first time that ever appeared was in the Buchla 100. But a cool feature of this one that I've never seen anywhere else is a correlation control. And correct me if I'm wrong, maybe there's one out there. But correlation control has 0 to 1 across the control, and if it's zero correlation, that means that every time that a pulse comes in here, it's totally new voltage anywhere in the range. With all the way up correlation, it doesn't change at all. So it's essentially a control for how far the next random voltage can be from the previous one, which is quite musical. It's not actually stopping it from going all the way through the range, it's just stopping how quickly it can jump to the next one, how many pulses it would take to go in that distance.
That's a bit. It just blows me away that someone could sit down and come up with that idea and then make the, it's like, it just blows me away. It's just incredible,
What's particularly mind-blowing about that is that when he did this, nobody had done it before. So there is a little bit of research out there in some of the textbooks about probability distributions, meaning if you had whatever wave was going to this sample and hold, you can see what the likelihood is that a different voltage in the range would be grabbed depending on what the wave shape is. And that's where you can really see that a triangle or a saw wave have absolutely equal distribution, and noise, in fact, doesn't. Noise actually favors the middle of the band. I wish I had it handy, and I should have thought of this before, but there's a page that Grant Richter put up onto his DIY page in the 90s that is a pretty exhaustive study of this concept and shows the distribution for every different wave shape, and also shows the spectral content of different waves as they go into the audio range. It's quite interesting stuff.
Yeah, I'm just looking at, in fact, I'll pull an image up of the Buchla 265 so people can check this out on a image on screen. What are the, there's white noise, low and high at the top of the module.
That's just Don Buchla's kooky way of saying white noise, pink noise, and I guess red, which
I see.
The difference, technically speaking, the difference between white noise and pink noise is that white noise is flat across all frequencies, and pink noise is flat across all octaves, which means it has a a half pole filter, only 3 dB per octave of roll off of the high frequencies. So theoretically, pink noise is more useful musically, but if we're going to filter it anyway, then maybe white noise is more useful to have the extra high frequency content available. And then low, as he calls it, is red, which is the white noise filtered with 1 pole filter, 6 dB per octave, instead of the half pole like the pink. So it's just a little bit darker still.
Right.
Cool. So is any of that, is it the white noise source? You say it's a triangle synced to a noise source.
Yeah, it's hard sync from the noise. So under whatever condition, if the noise signal goes above a certain level, then it resets the oscillator. And the reason for that is because if you had 2 clocks, even though the clocks, the internal clock and whatever your timing of your music, if your music was pulsing out samples from the sample and hold, maybe a 16th notes, some kind of subharmonic of some multiple of those 2 frequencies together will start to come out of the equation, and you'll actually start to hear a pattern developing. So a place that I've seen that before is I have an ARP sequencer, and there's a random input, but it's actually every time you trigger the random, you're just allowing this really high frequency clock to play for 1 millisecond or something real short. So it's actually has its own frequency built into it, and somehow patterns start to develop where you see it going like 1 7 5 6 1 7 5 6 and not, or something like that, depending on the combination. So it's not actually random.
So I guess that's like if you've got 2 detuned sine waves, it's like the beat frequency between the
Yes, something like that. Or if you were a DJ and you're trying to beat match and you're not making it, and then they drift so far off that they start to sound like they're in again. You know, something like that.
It'll drift out again and back in again, and
Exactly.
you get a slower sort of beat frequency thing. So
Exactly.
is that you talk about correlation on the 265, is that like what the distribution's doing on your random sampling module? That similar idea?
No, because this in the 265, the correlation control is basically a crossfader on the input of the sample and hold module. The correlation control is crossfading between a fresh stream of random data to draw from, and at the full correlation, it's the signal from the output. So it's crossfading between new data and regenerated data or feedback. So it's a totally analog implementation of this. Well, now's as good a time as any to talk about this one. This is the 266. So this one is the mid to late 70s implementation, I think about 1977. And by this point, some of these ideas have been developed a bit further. So now they're called fluctuating random voltages, and that's the same type of circuit as the probable rate of change section, but done with a little bit different electronics, even though it does the same thing. And then instead of having the stored randoms, this section are actually digital implementations of the idea. So they're no longer actually sample and holds. They're what they call pseudo-random signal generators, which are used a lot in synthesizers as noise sources when they're clocked at really high frequencies. But in this case, it's just receiving pulses externally and stepping through a sequence. The upside is that compared to sample and holds, they hold forever, they never droop, and you can, using weighted resistors or using different technology for the way that you decode the bits or convert the digital to analog, you can make different distributions. So I don't know if you can see this very well, but
I'll do the same again. I'll pull up an image and we can zoom in and see.
Yes, so in that quantized random section, quantized random voltages, you see the two different pictures. Those are done by weighting the resistors that are making the digital to analog conversion out of there's 6 bits coming out of the pseudo-random sequence generator, and because of the way that they're weighted, the distribution is different. So in the 2 to the n states, any one of the 64 states in the when the quantization is all the way up, any one of those 64 states is just as likely as the last, and in the n+1 states, the center of the range is more likely. That's the upside. The downside of this circuit is because it's a short pseudo-random sequence, it actually repeats, and we see that repeating in a pattern that's actually, in that case, only, because of its way it's configured, only 64 steps long. So if you take this module and trigger those quantized random voltages in time with a 4/4 beat, play 16th notes, every 4 bars you hear the pattern repeating, which, frankly,
so would that be the same pattern for every single version of the module, or different for each individual?
Same pattern. The thing is, you don't have any way to synchronize it, so where that pattern is starting is just luck of the draw. But what it's doing is going through all 64 possible states and actually showing each one of them one time in that sequence. So it's not. That's what makes it pseudo-random. It's jumping through in an order that's arbitrary. Well, it's decided by the circuit. It's not really arbitrary, but it doesn't like go up, higher over time or something. It jumps up and down all over the place, but it repeats. It would be possible to make a circuit like that using that pseudo-random sequence technique that went on for a much longer time. In fact, when they do noise generators, audio noise generators with them, they'll make them so that they take hours or days even to repeat, even though they're clocked at 300 kilohertz or something like that.
Sorry, go on.
Well, then in that case, you would have many thousands of states, and then you would never perceive a repeat. But in this particular case, in the mid-70s implementation of it, it wasn't that way. But that's when in the Verbos electronics module, this section, which is in some ways derived from that section in the buccal module, it's not actually using a sequence like that. It's randomly grabbing 6 bits of data. So that means that it doesn't have a sequence of any kind. Every time it's triggered, it's a brand new an opportunity. So it's more similar in that respect to an analog sample and hold randomly grabbing a voltage, because it doesn't have any commitment to a pattern, or in other words, it's very likely that we could go on for quite some time and never see a certain voltage in the equation, because it has no obligation to grab all of them. It's like a lottery where, if we put everyone's name into a hat and reached in and we threw the names back in every time, then it doesn't actually change the probability that it's just as likely each time that each person's name is chosen, because we're not eliminating any from the equation.
Yeah. So just before we move on, with the idea of hearing this pattern looping and the values being infinite, is that in the same way that something like a Turing machine, if we lock the stream of data at audio rate, we get a tone, because we're perceiving, well, that's however many steps you set it to, between 2 and 32. But if you've got 8 random voltages that you lock at audio rate, we just hear that as a waveform, just a random pulse wave, but it's set. So is that...
I can't speak with any authority on the Turing machine, because I know what it is, but I don't know how it was done. But I can tell you that if you would, with a wavetable oscillator, for instance, where you have Most of the time they're 256 steps long. If you just fill that wavetable with noise, and then you play a sequence that's only 256 steps long, you will perceive a pitch, and when you change the clock speed, you'll perceive that pitch going one direction or another.
Yeah, that's right then, yeah, because it's a random stream of data that you can lock within 2 to 16 steps. If the same 16 steps constantly repeat the audio, you perceive the pitch, as you said.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas if you have a sequence that's much longer, like one of these pseudo-random sequences that is, for instance, the one that is making the noise source in here is 65,000 stages long. So it's long enough that you'll never, no matter how long you listen to it, you're never going to perceive the looping because it's just too far apart.
I'll bring a picture of your module up. Now's a good time to get into that one. So we can see the same sort of distribution pattern with the quantized randoms, and you just make noise sources. How's the quantized random different in circuit to the fluctuating random?
Well, it's the same type of digital sample and hold that's happening, which is grabbing 6 bits of random data and then holding it, converting it into a stream of 64 different voltage levels. But in the fluctuating random, there's an internal clock. So you have voltage control of the clock speed, and there's a low-pass filter that's correlated to the clock. But you'll just hear out of the CV outputs in fluctuating randoms, you're just going to hear a wavering voltage that you have control over the rate that it's wavering. But what's nice about the one in my module is that the range goes much wider than what was in the Buco source of uncertainty. So you can actually use the CV as a tunable noise source too. So you can sweep the fluctuation rate and get noise with different spectrums.
So how's that? I mean, for me, well, I'm asking as well for me learning this stuff, and surely everybody watching as well, but when I think of things like the fluctuating randoms, it's sort of easy to think of those as like a sample and a hold with a slew on it, and that would be a similar effect.
But the thing is that in this type of circuit, if the slew, which is essentially a low-pass filter that's just at a
TV rate,
very low range, yeah. If the change of the cutoff of that filter isn't tracking the rate of the VCO that's clocking the sample and hold exactly, then the level range of the CV won't stay consistent throughout the range of the rates. You know what I mean?
If the slew time would allow you to jump a volt within 1 second, if it fluctuates 4 volts, the rate's not changing enough to then let it do that 4-volt jump in the same time, because the slew time is the same. Exactly.
So the magic behind it, or the nerd portion of behind this, is that you need to make it so that the low-pass filter is rounding off the steps over the course of the length of the step. So the way that it works out, if you have the same capacitor in the integrator section of the VCO and the integrator sections of the low-pass filter, then they're going to track perfectly anyway. So the course of the time that a stage is on or held is rounded so that there aren't any flat spots, and there aren't and it doesn't reduce the level at all.
Yeah. I think a nice way of thinking of that for anyone that this is just gone boom right over their head.
Yeah.
If you think about, I mean, it's super geek talk anyway, this whole podcast, so this is what we want. But for anyone, it has gone over their heads, and it certainly would have done mine not so long ago. If you think about a filter filtering an audio rate saw wave, if that saw wave stays the same and you filter it to the exact wave shape you want, and then you start repitching the saw wave, the wave shape changes. And that's why a filter has a volt per octave input. in some instances, so you can leave the oscillator static, filter it by the amount you want, and then share the same 1 volt per octave, and that wave shape will track. I guess this is the same thing, but down at lower levels. Or have I completely missed the mark?
Well, the problem is that if you have, if your cutoff frequency of your filter and the frequency of your VCO weren't matched, and even worse than not matched, like it wouldn't be the end of the world if they were out of synchronization by a fixed amount but always tracked together. Like if your filter was filtering an octave lower than it should be, at least it would stay the same level throughout the range. But if they're not tracking together, then maybe at the low frequencies you'll have a voltage range of 0 to 10 volts, and then as you get higher in frequency, it will get smaller and smaller in range because the filter is not opening up enough to let the whole range through.
Yeah.
One way to picture it is actually maybe thinking about the way that a filter affects a square wave is better, because you imagine the square wave showing up as hard, sharp edges, and then as you filter it, those corners are rounded down until you get to a sine wave. But when you go even below that, the sine wave will just start to fade away.
Yeah.
So our problem could be that we haven't just rounded the corners off of that voltage, but we've also started to get rid of it.
So that's like, again, if you had a really low pitch saw, you filter it, let's 100 hertz saw wave, for example, you filter it so you're near enough getting something quite pure and sine-like. If you then pitch the saw wave up 5 octaves, it's filtered so much that you don't hear anything. It seems like the volume is decreasing.
Exactly. And the nature of filters, like if you say a frequency on your oscillator, that's actually what the fundamental frequency is. But the frequency that you're talking about when you say the cutoff of your filter is the point at which that fundamental has been reduced by 3 dB. It's the 3 dB down point. So actually, if you made them identical, you would see a reduction in the level down 3 dB, which is pretty significant when you're listening, not as significant when you're using it for control voltage.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess now is a good time. Well, I think we should go through the rest of the random sampling and as much history as you want to throw it, as it's a real sort of educational process for us.
Yeah.
Having you on.
Well, part of the thing about this module is that I'm drawing from a lot of experience and a lot of kind of nerd level stuff to what goes into this module, but the majority of the users don't give a crap about any of that. So, it's more about how it's usable for them. So
yeah, what I was going to say, and then I changed my mind, was talk about the uses of this stuff. But I think if we just sort of go through, because you've got the analog shift register at the bottom, and I'd also like to ask how the gates are derived, just so we'll get the rest of the module, and then we'll get application stuff, how each of us likes to use this sort of thing, and your ideas for where it's used.
Exactly. So the analog shift register is some extra nerd history stuff.
Hit us with it.
There was a Japanese engineer who was working at CalArts in the 70s. CalArts, of course, the California Institute of the Arts, where in the 70s Morton Subotnick was working there, and they had Buchla 200 systems in 3 rooms, and Subotnick did Wild Bowls, I think. I don't know. He did some of his famous recordings on the systems there, and around, I guess, 78, 79, when Subotnick was already gone, Barry Schrader was working there, and he did a bunch of records using the Buchlas there. And this Japanese gentleman was doing maintenance on the system and doing some research projects, and he asked Barry Schrader if there was anything that the Buchla didn't do that he wished it did. And so Barry came up with 4 different ideas for things that he would like, and those things were 2 different variations on a voltage processor and slewing thing, and a gating matrix that allowed routing signals from voltages and from triggers, and then finally the analog shift register. So that was the first time that there ever was an analog shift register, is one of what they called the fortune modules, because evidently this Japanese guy's name was too hard for Americans to pronounce, so they just called him Fortune. And after that, Serge Cherepnin, who made the Serge modular, he took that idea and developed a module for the Serge system, the analog shift register, and he wrote an article in the Synapse magazine in, I guess, about 1980, and that may have been, I don't know that there's another, is there another analog shift register floating around being made now? I know
there's digital ones, but I'm not sure for analog.
Yeah, maybe we could get onto that in a bit, I suppose, about the digital v analog in the shift register realm.
Well, shift registers in a computer world just pass on one bit of digital data down a line, but an analog shift register would be storing a voltage, so it's actually a series of sample and holds that pass the data from one to the next down the line. The one that was in the Surge system and the one that was in the Fortune module were 3 stages long, and the one that I've done here is 4 stages long. I'm not sure that there are enough musical uses for an analog shift register to really justify the expense of building it and the panel real estate to have it, because it's a really specific effect. It's nice for echoing control voltages. Sometimes it's nice to have a stream of notes followed by that same stream of notes, one pulse delayed for another voice. But as those 4 sample and holds just sit there rotting because you don't want that one effect, that just made me think that this would be an opportunity to rethink the thing a little bit. So I made those 4 sample and holds accessible individually too. So you have the ability to use any one of them or up to all 4 of them on their own as sample and holds. And because the logic, this is a little bit nerdy, heady stuff, but the logic that derives the pulses that trigger these 4 sample and holds is that they have to delay, they have to start by sampling the last sample and hold in the chain, and then the third, and then the second, and then the first, and that all takes place over the course of 2 milliseconds, but it's required because otherwise when the 4th one samples, if the 3rd one has already changed, then it won't be able to take what's there. So that also allows some tricks that just were lucky breaks in this equation, the sense that if you put the same fast fluctuating random voltage into all 4 CV inputs at the bottom and then send a pulse into trigger, you will actually get 4 different voltages held at the outputs, because that slight delay between them allows for something else to come up on those 4. So it gives an opportunity to have, for the folks who are just looking for as many pulse-driven random voltages as possible, like the patches that Matthew was talking about, where you want to have everything change from one note to the next. That just gives you an additional 4 possible places to draw from.
Yeah, so I think now's a good time. You mentioned the idea of echo in a musical phrase. A good time to get into some uses. I've never used, well, yours being the only one I'm aware of. Me and Matthew were lucky to get some time with you, and that's how we met and spoke at Super Booth. Just to dig that in, Greg, that you didn't go again. Sorry, Greg. I'm digging at everyone that didn't go still. But what's some musical ideas for the sort of things that you'd want to echo in terms of if you had 4 different oscillators and you wanted notes to flurry down, or how
it's a possibility to treat them if your stream of notes is continuous, like playing all 16th notes or something like that, then you will find it to have the same kind of effect as having a delay of a 16th note. Of course, it uses a whole lot more modules to get that to happen, since they all need to be separate voices. But it also can be an interesting effect to just have the same stream of notes happening in the same order, but not correlated like an echo, but just happening, passing that down the line by one. It can be thought of as something that's under some kind of control, but it also can be thought of as something that will introduce a mind of its own into the equation, which might be interesting in certain circumstances.
Yeah, so you might have a particular phrase that moves a filter on one part of a patch, a wave folder on another, a delay time on something else, but they're all offset from each other. So you hear this flurry happen 4 different ways, if you like.
Also a possibility, yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to sort of brainstorm and essentially talk myself.
What's it called in like a musical? Is it called something like either an arabesque or round?
Yes, something like that, right? Now we show our lack of musicality.
Yeah, exactly. It does. Yeah.
Well, they said canon type.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, in terms of classical terms, it would be a canon if voices within a range of musicians or instruments were echoing the same part. That would be a canon. You often find it between string lines, moving down between string parts in classical work.
Yeah, but someone will play one little phrase, that's finished, it moves on to the next string or whatever instrument, they play that, and then it gets passed on again.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But this is happening just one pulse apart. So, but having the four stages allows you to not use. You don't necessarily have to use all 4. You could just use the first and the fourth, or the original, which isn't even held, and then 4 after it. So you could echo, by a few pulses and have that pass down the line a little bit more. But you don't have to think of it as something so contrived. You can use it more experimentally and just see what happens, which is probably more effective.
Mm.
Yeah, just thinking of it as 4 related randoms if you've got fast fluctuating random in there.
I mean, the only other ones that I kind of know of at the moment from a shift, I won't say analog, I'll just say shift registers that are out there at the moment. It's the one that Ben's just mentioned.
Synthesis technology one?
Yeah, synthesis technology one. Then there's the Snazzy FX telephone game.
I think the telephone game, it is really similar to an analog shift register, but it has some extra, and I'd have to look at the module again, but I think it has some extra control over mixing or volume control between the stages. Is that right?
Something sort of slight. And then the other one, the only one that I have that's got something is the Make Noise Telharmonic has a shift register function. It's kind of like a hidden, I guess, function in it where you basically, I forgot which key it is. You hold down one of the knobs for like 5 seconds and it enters the shift register mode, and that's really neat. I've been playing around with that quite a lot recently. I don't know exactly how many stages it's got in. I think it may be 5, but don't quote me on that. But that's really kind of nice, and I've just kind of really enjoyed playing with that recently.
Well, just for reference, I know people like pictures. Here's the synthesis technology one. Again, I've no experience with that either. I don't think I have any kind of shift register at all. And there's the Snazzy effects.
I think that the trick here is with the telephone game, the Snazzy effects one, is that it has several stages of feedback. Maybe, is that right?
Right.
I'm not sure actually.
I think that the curse of that module is how complicated it is, that it can be kind of hard to figure out what's happening. But he was able to demonstrate some really wild things coming out of it, but I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, you've got to get in that headset with that kind of module, haven't you, really?
Yeah. Well, and my tendency is to really want to know the technical details. There are people out there who prefer to just try wild things and see what happens, but that's not really my speed.
Mm.
I'm a nerd about this stuff, so I want to really know what I'm doing.
Mm.
Well, I think there's bonuses to both. You know, whether you just wildly just patch and see what happens, and then know what happens. I think it's a bit like whether you know music theory or not, where it's actually really helpful if you know it at a certain level, whereas it can be quite restrictive when you don't really understand it and quite hard to replicate certain things or understand what's going on. But then there's others that don't know music theory, and a lot of great music that's just, let's just try stuff, let's just whatever sequence of notes.
In the moment that everything is just on an uncalibrated, unlabeled knob, you really have no ability to use real music theory anyway. So,
yeah, it's just thrown out of the window with this stuff. So, how are you? Well, the other side people may not know from you making modules is your own musical background, and in terms of your performance and your music, you go out with 6U of your own stuff and a 909.
right.
How does this fit into what you're doing, which is essentially just live techno with, as I said, your modules and the 909?
Well, there's definitely something to in a situation, I should say, in a situation where one is improvising music with a modular in front of a crowd, and in that situation, there isn't room for a lot of trying things out and seeing what happens. So I think that situation really favors more packaged solutions, or things from modules that are more like, we know what we're going to get, and you flip this switch and you turn this knob and this happens, versus some of the more open-ended type of modular options where there might be 10% of what you can get out of it that's really incredible, but then the rest of it is fumbling around trying to figure out how to get something usable, which is a really big difference between those two. And there's nothing wrong with modules that require more tweaking to get something good, but they really only work in situations where you have the time and the luxury of trying some things before anybody hears it. Whereas on a stage, in front of people, it requires first of all, to have a good relationship with the equipment so that you know what you're going to get from it, but also have the parameters of these modules reined in a way that can be controlled and get the result that you're expecting somehow.
So, for an example, then, if you've got 4 to the floor kick pounding 16th note bass line, and this is just personal preference, obviously no right or wrong from anyone with this, but what would be your first thing you tend to reach for random for in that situation?
Well, my tendency is with when I'm doing performances now, and I'm using the random sampling now, I tend to use the fluctuating randoms a lot more than anything else, because I can then really simply know that from this control, like if this knob's facing 10 o'clock, I roughly know the speed of the random fluctuation that I'm going to get, so I can predict how much I'm going to affect a certain parameter with that very successfully. Whereas some of the other random modulation possibilities are just not as immediate for me in those situations. Some people prefer the kind of, like we were talking about before, the pulse-driven, like each new note has a new value kinds of random sequences, and that's available in that module, but I don't find myself using that as much in a live situation because it's harder for me to get to it in a patch.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the first thing. When people think random, and there may have been people that saw this episode was about random and thought, no, that's not for me. pitch, oscillator pitch from a random, the typical bleeps and bloops that most modular meets tend to descend into. You walk into just boop beep boop boop beep boop boop beep, and that's most people think of that. But I guess sample and hold to a filter or something is probably the first sort of thing people do, where they then start to feel like they get it or it's useful or.
Oh, right, and that's a case where I think you have to remember that you're not required to use a random modulator for the VCO pitch, and you're not required to open a parameter across its entire range with a random control. Maybe just offering a little variation note to note just to keep it from getting so tiresome to always be the same wave shape and filter cut off the same everything.
Well, that probably plays into what you do, Greg, whereas I said at the start Matthew needs to go see a council help group for his random addiction. Greg, you're probably the other way, in that you make house music and house patches that I imagine a lot of people viewing have seen on your Instagram and Facebook and things. Is that how you're going for it? More tonal change, heavily attenuated?
Yeah, yourself and Mark touched upon it. The way I use random is it's heavily reined back, and it's in subtle amounts, mostly into filters. I never really use it that much for pitch. I will use the Turing machine out with random voltages, but that's into a quantizer, and I have the option to lock it then.
Yeah, so I guess that's because you can let it generate a phrase and go, right, I want that 8-step sequence, and then to the listener it's no discernible. It's more like a sequence than a random source at that point.
Yeah. Or I'll send the pulses out to a sample and hold. The pulses and the noise from the Turing machine, both out to a sample and hold. And the pulses will be grabbing it, and I can send that back in to lock at certain points as well.
So you're using random gates derived from a clock as opposed to the Turing machine CV?
Yeah, it's still all clocked into... I'll have something running my master clock. I'll have something like circadian rhythms or something running a master clock with all my drums coming from there.
Right. And again, are you using any random to modulate, say, the locking on the Turing machine? So you find a rhythm that you like, you lock it.
Yeah, I will sometimes feed it back into itself. I'll sometimes feed the sample and hold back in to lock the Turing machine.
Right. So it's not essentially a major part of what you do, and you're thinking.
No, this is all going to filter modulation. It's I like to use it on some of my crazier filters, something like the Medic Modules defibrillator, because that thing will just screech and howl at certain points. As Mark touched upon there, it's heavily attenuated as well. So
yeah,
it's
it doesn't have to be that wide open, does it? It's like you say, it's just. So it's almost a silly thing to say about classic random sound, but there is, isn't there? There is the kind of Louis and Bibi Baron type, bleeps and bloops sort of stuff, and of course that's fine. But it should be more about how these things can be brought into other creative areas. Like it's really interesting listening to you, Greg, talk about those kind of things. So, for instance, if you did have some kind of fairly constant kind of rhythm, say maybe something like what Mark's doing, but then you've just got these slightly evolving opening envelope shapes or slightly evolving filter things where the interest is there, and like I say, it's just, rather than the full gamut, it's been actually pulled into a certain creative musical sort of section.
Exactly. Well, that's an interesting, the enveloped shapes and times. I think that's a place where there's a real benefit to a subtle random modulation, particularly the kind that comes from a sample and hold or from a stored random source, where out in the real world, not to minimize the value of electronic sounds, but acoustic sounds aren't fatiguing and boring in the way that electronic sounds can be, and part of that is that all of the different elements of the sound, the shape of the attack and the tone and the volume and all of those things are changing all the time, maybe just in very, very subtle ways. So in the interest of making tones or timbres that don't bore us and don't become monotonous, it's nice to do these very slight variations on unexpected parameters.
Well, I think that's my sort of favourite thing, is having a bank of several sample and holds, and say sustain level, decay time, filter cutoff, and VCA level all under 4 different random values, but all heavily attenuated. And it might be, as you said, like a real instrument. You can't pick the string at exactly the same, with the exact same force or velocity every single time. A human can't replicate the exact same note length every time, or and I think that's where the interest comes for me. Even within, like you, Greg, like a really strict, let's say like a 4-bar pattern, or even a 1-bar 16th note sequence, you know, techno drums, very much a framework. I think that's where, for me, I get more interest and sort of fun out of those patches, because you get that initial buzz from making a sequence, I think, and then your ear starts to, like you said, Mark, it fatigues because it's exactly the same. What's one thing we've not mentioned on your module, Mark, and something that we'll get onto for other modules that we use as well, but how are the gates derived on the random sampling?
On the fluctuating randoms, each one of those has a gate output, and those are not they're not comparators that are on the CV or something like that. They're actually uncorrelated. So the rate that the gate goes on is controlled by the fluctuation rate, but it's unrelated to the CV level at that moment.
Right. Because that's a good way for someone, if you think, right, I don't have any random gates, I want to try this stuff, just put a sample and hold CV into an envelope generator, because every gate input on a circuit is going to have a level at where it will trigger. And often manuals will say that, you know, envelope generator, any signal above a volt will trigger the envelope. So just patch the CV in, which is the same thing as you said if it was comparator derived. Something goes above a level, ping, and an output goes.
Yeah, well, I hadn't really thought of doing what we were just talking about, like running gates through sample and holds instead of CVs. So we're really just then able to put a predictable pattern, or maybe just a stream of 16th notes through to the gate input or the trigger input on the sample and hold, and then a gate into the CV input, and then get a random series of pulses that are happening in the grid, but at random times. It's an interesting twist too.
Yeah, me, Greg, and Matthew will certainly get some audio prepared and have some patch examples when this goes live, and I'll do one for that. And again, it comes down to a lot of things of CV utilities, the sort of boring stuff that people forget, attenuation and slew and offset. I really like, say, a 16th note clock into a sample and hold, the CV output, which is a fluctuating CV range, into some sort of CV utility, again, say a Manhattan analog CVP, which is level, offset, and slew. And if you attenuate it heavily enough, you can just use the offset amount as almost a probability that you will trigger, say, an envelope down the line, or a clock module, something that needs a clock or a gate to trigger an event. And then that attenuation range and the offset become your sort of probability controls. So you can offset the voltage to just under where your envelope generator will trigger all the time, and then just let an attenuated amount of sample and hold occasionally not let it trigger. You're never going to get random bursts, which I think is something you were talking about with the nanorand, Matthew, but based on that clock, that 16th note clock, certain values will or won't trigger to the envelope generator.
Oh, I've used that technique you've just described a lot. You know, I mean, I just want to sort of talk briefly about the fact that, you know, when you said at the beginning of the show, like, oh yeah, Matt's got all these random modules and stuff, and the reason why I have is, like, when I was about 16 in my hometown, we had a really good library, and in that library you could borrow records, and for some reason, I don't know who was working behind the place there, they just had the most far out, incredible LPs that you could just go and borrow. Anyway, I got this LP just because I liked the cover of it, and got this home, and it was Douglas Leady's Entropical Paradise, which was the first triple electronic album. And Douglas Leady was, well, he found the UCLA's electronic music department, and this in Tropical Paradise, in all the sleeve notes, I sat there and read this, like I said, when I was about 16. This was a completely automated, auto-generated composition, and it was like, I think there was 2 sides done on a Moog, and the other 2 sides were done on a Buchla system. And this just blew me away, that the fact that in his sleeve notes he talks about when all the patch was set up and everything was going, he kind of like pressed go and had no further involvement in the patch, and that really stuck with me. And that's basically my genesis of how I create all my pieces. I mean, we all do things in different ways, but like I said, I really consider it a success when I've done everything, set all the parameters, then I just sit back and watch it, you know. And that's why I have so many random modules, is to enable me to do nothing effectively. That's what I like about them, you know. So yeah, the more I get, the less I can do. So that's great by me.
That's an interesting point about the whole composition being automated somehow. At the NAMM show last year, Gary Chang was in my booth, and he went to CalArts during the 70s and studied under Subotnick and worked on those Buchlas. And he told me that his favorite part of the Buchla 200 was that the 284 envelope generator, which is, if you don't know it, it's just a delay, attack, hold, release envelope, which is fairly pedestrian, really, because it has a voltage control in, and it's not CVNs for the individual stages, but just overall. But because there's a CVN and you have such a huge range of voltage available, these CVs are 15-volt swings, you could crank all the levels to be as slow as possible, and then send in an additional huge amount of CV to make it even slower. And he would do these soundtrack type ambient soundscape pieces where it would take the entire course of the 10 minutes for the piece to go through the envelope cycle one time. And he would use that varying, and he would set it up to, there are 4 of them in the module. He would set up 4 that were in that kind of range of slow, and assign them to parameters that would slowly evolve over the course of the whole composition. And it was something I'd never even considered. And he said it was his favorite part of the instrument.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I grab a picture again. So that plays into how you like to use envelopes as timing devices, Matthew. For the second,
it's exactly. I was going to say exactly the same thing. Yeah, that's kind of at the core of what I do, is using envelopes as timing generators, because you can just get these fantastically subtle kind of fades in and then speeding up, and then this is all without actually using a random module. And that's basically at the core of what I do, and then use all these other different random ones to introduce other little, like, you know, just basically things like filters opening or other little pieces. But yeah, it's absolutely at the core of that. But I mean, back to briefly this Douglas Leedy album. If since we're on the subject of random, if you haven't heard it, I really suggest listening to it, just because it was a kind of a landmark piece. It may seem a little dated now, but you know, just because it's kind of easier for us to do this. But at that time, like say 71, it was amazing. You know, it's kind of like these, almost like being in this electronic jungle almost. You know, it's just these kind of, you know, almost like bird sounds from another planet.
So well, that's an interesting point. How are people getting random-like values out of non-random devices? For you, Matthew, that was essentially self-patching a IntelliGel Quadra, an expander.
Yeah, which is kind of based on the module you just put up. It's because the key to that one is that it puts out a gate pulse. You know, I think at the end of rise or end of cycle, I think it is. So that's how you can get random pulses out from that. And then as well as obviously having, say like you've got your first envelope, and then you use your second envelope to modulate the attack of your first one, and then like the third envelope to use as a modulation for the decay of the first. So each one of those, and they're set at different speeds in cycling. So when they kind of collide and cross into each other, you get all these different timing values will come out at the end of cycle. So that technique is just great for me. I love using that.
Well, I like things like having, again, 16th note steady clock into a VCA or a AND logic module and just some unsynced LFO.
Yeah.
Maybe CV that LFO. And then when that's high enough within the circuit in the AND, I'll get a trigger, but only when both the 16th note clock and this fluctuating LFO are at a peak. I quite like deriving rhythms that way.
Yeah, it's really good, that technique. It's just so simple, but you've still got your clock. Again, it's back to having it like the other one you mentioned. It's like you've got your clock, but that will just randomly bring in things in and out, but it'll still be in time.
Yeah.
Something we use a lot as well. Is that
what, stacking LFOs into logic, or?
Yeah. I use my plug that way.
Yeah, that's why I've got the plug for that.
So how are you doing rhythm generation, Mark, with what you're doing? Because yours, I mean, with 909 drum machine and techno, you think, right, it's rhythm based, it's steady.
Yeah, you have the whatever you program on the rim shot pattern. There's a trigger output that sends out that pattern. So the most basic way to use that is to just send out every 16th note and step along a sequencer playing this 16th note pattern, and then take out notes in the chain using the switches. Or you can program a rhythm in the drum machine to make some sort of pattern of gates that will then advance a sequencer or trigger whatever source of pitches. So it's fairly flexible, but again, how much you can do in an entirely improvised situation with a modular is much more limited than what you could do if you had all the time in the world to experiment with different ideas and see what works.
Well, yeah, it's very different. You performing to a large crowd in a club to us nerding out with this stuff behind us.
Exactly. We don't have the benefit of whatever chemicals they're using to get them to just want to hear the same thing over and over again.
What you touched on, though, I think is a nice idea. When you've got, say, a sequencer, 8-step sequencer, 16, whatever, that's expecting a steady clock to do its thing, but when you feed it something like a sequence you've programmed on the 909 or another rhythm generator from anywhere, and you give this 8-step sequence maybe only 5 notes per bar, because that's how many you've triggered in your rhythm sequence. But then if you also use a sequencer where you can turn gates on and off, you can have, it sort of gives a sort of pseudo-random pattern, because you'd expect 8 clocks, 8 steps per bar. Now we're only getting 5 steps triggering this thing, so we don't quite get the sequences lining up with a musical bar that's sort of ticking over from the master clock. And then if you turn some of those gates off, you get these patterns that seem to shift like they're out of time, like running a pattern of 5 over 8, or if you then turn further gates off, you reduce the number and you extend. It's like how many times in a sequence the numbers 5 and 8 match up. The more you mess with it, it just takes more and more and more times to loop back around, giving pseudo-random, but nicely like what you're doing, Greg, and most of my patches, with set values on the sequencer. It's just those notes will always be, say, a C, E, G, if it's just a basic sequence, but they're not happening as you'd expect. And by them jamming and playing on the 909 or the rhythm generator, you get a sort of nicely moving pattern. And anything like that, for me, into a quantizer, I like just really restricting. I guess IntelliGel does it as well, but I don't know if you can see it, the red module at the back, the ADAT quantizer with a little keyboard to turn notes off. I like just having maybe 3 or 4 notes and nothing else on there, and just letting the random go completely wild, and maybe trigger the quantizer as well, so I know I'm always going to get in time steps. It's going to be 1 of 3 notes, and that's it, and then let something else make decisions.
Well, that's it in a nutshell. You have your quantizer running with a set amount of values for notes, and you have your triggers for it as well. So everything's related to everything else, And that's pretty much how I use random in my patches. As long as there's a relation between the random to whatever else I'm running, in time or quantized or whatever, that's it. That's pretty much how I run it, and heavily attenuated as well.
Yeah, yeah. Does anyone, out of curiosity, use random data to change the level of things?
Yeah, again, back to using that Quadra setup with the envelopes. I may have one of those affecting the final kind of VCA. So you'll just get sort of swoops of sound will come in and out. But again, within a fixed value.
Do you do it for levels of CV? Because I don't do it all the time, but having like a digital LFO that you can clock to say 4 steps or 4 clock pulses, and then having a sample and hold that's triggered at the cycle length of the LFO. So say a sine wave takes 4 clock pulse to do a full cycle, have a divide by 4 clock, let that generate a random value on a sample and hold with noise at its input, and then just put that LFO into a VCA, so every time this cycle of the LFO repeats, its amplitude changes. I find that's quite a nice one. Again, and with the LFO being, say, a sine or a triangle or something smoother, you're not noticing those sort of hard changes, you're just realising that these profs aren't quite going as far, or it pushes up and catches your ear a bit more. Quite like stuff like that. Does anyone, what about logic stuff? Anyone using, again, to derive gates maybe, or?
Well, that's what I touched on earlier. That's what I've used, where you've got a clock again, and then just an unsynced LFO, and that's how I've used that technique a lot.
What about I'm just reeling off things that people might ask and general ideas. Clocked noise sources and really reducing the clock down. You get that Atari style that goes from white noise down, but if you've got one that will go low enough, that essentially becomes like a sample and a hold in itself. Yeah,
it does. I've got one of the DOFA modules. I've got 2 DOFA modules that are noise modules. One of them's a digital noise, and that goes down quite low.
I've got the rainbow noise, and I mix noises on that and then filter them down a bit more as well. So yeah, I do kind of use it that way, as a kind of pseudo sample and hold.
Maybe one for you, Mark. How's analog noise derived? What's the difference? Because I get the digital noise, if it's enough values at such a high rate, it just sounds like white noise.
Analog noise is generally derived from a diode or a transistor, where it's biased to the center of its range, and then just the self noise is amplified up 1,000 times or whatever in order to create a usable signal level. But historically, that is thought of as having problems because all of the radio frequencies, or all of the talk radio leaking into your signal that you're then amplifying or whatever. So already in the 70s, they started to try and replace the analog noise sources with digital imitators of noise, and the noise source that you see inside of a Korg monopoly or in a Buka 266 or maybe a memory Moog. I don't remember all the ones, but there's one called a MM5837. The problem with that noise source is it sounds like noise, except the loop of noise it's playing is about 1 second long, so it sounds a bit like a train is chugging by.
It goes like that, doesn't it?
And inside of a patch, that's probably not much of an issue because there's more going on, and you're not going to just leave it exposed as noise. But it's still something that people complained about a lot. So these days, when you see a digital noise generator, it usually is a long enough sequence that you don't hear it repeating. The noise in the random sampling is digitally generated, but it takes hours to repeat, so you'll never hear any kind of pattern. I think that the digital noise is nice because it's very controllable. You can, by figuring out how fast the clock will be and how many stages it is and how you've weighted the different outputs together, you can create the color of noise that you want. And theoretically, you could change the clock speed and sweep the spectrum, like what you were talking about, like a kind of chiptunes lo-fi thing.
Yeah.
You can actually take any of these quantized random sequences, like in the Buchlas or in the Doepfer one. That's I don't know what the model is, but it's essentially
A149.
Yeah, Doepfer's source of uncertainty.
Yeah, the one that does the quantized randoms. If you clock those modules with an audio rate VCO with the square wave output, then you can use that output as an audio signal and get that lo-fi digital noise sound. And it's 6 bits, and you can control the quantization down to just being 1 bit, which is just random square waves. I'm not crazy about that, like chiptunes type of sound, but
No, me neither.
yeah, sometimes it's nice for percussion sounds that are real crunchy, lo-fi, just one sound in your in your mix, not an entire mix of really low fidelity sounds. Actually, and that's what you can do with the fluctuating randoms on a random sampling. If you bring it up into the audio range, you have control of the spectrum of the noise, so it can be used to make drum sounds or sweeping kind of sounds.
That plays as if we planned it. That plays nicely into the metallic noise and its history for drums. Do you want to take us through what the metallic noise is?
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's the first implementation, but the most famous implementation of that is in the TR-808 and TR-606 and CR-78, all those old analog drum machines that Roland did. They made their cymbal sounds by using a mix of 6 square wave VCOs, well, not even VCOs, just oscillators, not voltage controlled, but at fixed frequencies that are not in any way related to each other, so really dissonant. And by mixing all of those together and then filtering them, they're able to get this metallic resonant noise, something similar to what you get by hitting a piece of metal. So I have that in the noise source of the random sampling, and actually it's not based on that circuit, it's just based on that idea. It also does some ring modulation to make it a little bit denser. I use it for cymbal type sounds or dissonant high frequency sizzles, but maybe there's some other idea that it's good for that I haven't thought of. You could theoretically filter it down below audio range and use it as a modulator too.
Yeah, I mean, things like that through a low-pass gate or with an envelope tight into a VCA, just nice, easy metallic percussion. And I think noise like that and the clock noise, you can almost get like bacon frying in a pan type sounds with a filter self-oscillating, really high pitch, and then attenuate some sort of downsampled, clock rate reduced, or maybe the metallic noise to actually change the cutoff of the filter. And if you keep it really high, just sort of on the edge of human hearing range, almost sounds like bacon frying.
Yeah.
I don't know what the music you're doing is that requires bacon frying.
It was Rick Holt from Frequency Central that told me that one. We were passing ideas around for a video of one of his modules that I did.
You play live at a lot of breakfast bars, that's where it is.
I think Matthew Herbert actually did performances where he recorded bacon frying.
He did, didn't he?
I'm not going to get into making breakfast sounds. But yeah, cool. I think there's a lot in there for people to check out, hell of a lot of stuff for people to get into. Any particular links to anything people want to share, or obviously go check out Mark's random sampling. Again, sorry to dig Greg, but we had a good play with it at Super Booth. Really fun module that I know me and Matthew probably end up with. You gave me a bit of stick for Matthew, not Mark, not having Verbos modules behind me, but I think that would bring a lot of the ideas together that I'm using several different modules for. With the
That's part of what we're trying to do here is make it very accessible to do. Some of the things that you're talking about that might require you to use 4 different modules and this really complicated patch to get to. Hopefully, these implementations allow it to be done, in a musical way where you don't have to disrupt your creative flow in order to get this.
Well, that's the first thing that attracted me to. I mean, obviously, reeled off this big long list of the ones that I have, but that's what really attracted to me when I saw it at Superbooth. Was I thought, what a great mixture of features all in the same module. Like, I have quite a few others that do independently those things, but all in one. It's like, bang, there you go. You've got some really good features all there, and that's what attracted me to it.
Great.
Well, I mean, for you, Mark, it's obviously the ultimate random module. It's everything you researched and wanted to use. And I think
some of the lessons that I learned from my working with these older implementations of these ideas, hopefully, the things when I said I really wish it could do this, or I really wish it wasn't like that I can bring that into my implementation and hopefully move the thing forward a little bit.
Yeah. Is there just one for you maybe, Matthew, because you've got this. Do you know, I mean, we don't have him on obviously to discuss it himself, but the random source or the surge smooth step generator?
I think an interesting anecdotal explanation of that is that really what Serge was trying to do when he created the Serge modular in the first place was that, well, he was working at CalArts, and the 3 Buchla labs had waiting lists that were months long to get any time on the Buchla systems, and those machines were so expensive that there was just plain no way that a person could ever buy them. It was like buying a house. So he wanted to make a machine that could do all of the cool things that a Buchla could do, but that was affordable so an individual could own it. Now, the irony of that is that the Serge modular in the 80s became incredibly expensive, but it was cheap in its original implementation. So most of the ideas that are in the Serge are cheaper and simpler ways of doing the things that were in the Buchla already in a really expensive and complicated way. So, and I mean cheaper, I don't mean simpler from the perspective of the user, I mean simpler in the electronics. And sometimes that means that it's harder for the user because the things are so raw, they have to be patched in fairly complicated ways to get something to happen. So the smooth and stepped module is an attempt to do a lot of what was in the source of uncertainty, but in a more efficient way. So with the right patching, the smooth generator can make a fluctuating random, and the stepped can act as a stored random or a sample and hold type situation. I suppose that those, now that they're in that one you were showing, that's the Eurorack ones that
that's
Chip making, or how are they?
It's random source that's these, but it's in. I think he's in talking to Serge about it, and I think they're using some newer chips, and it's all sort of.
It's the that's VCAs and things that
really? Signed off by Serge himself that if that was available, he would have used it. Sort of. Yeah.
Well, the problem is that at the risk of getting really off into the synth nerd direction, this module used CA3080s, these old OTA chips that are no longer being made. So something like the SSM2164, which isn't being made either, but there's a cool audio clone of it that is, it would be a logical replacement for those to do the same types of circuits, but not use any chips you can't get.
Yeah.
So what?
Yeah, he's definitely kind of in contact with Serge, and I think any kind of, like where you may hit a brick wall of like, oh, this just simply isn't available anymore. He's been kind of sending you ideas. Well, this is the closest thing, or this can actually do it better, and he's kind of given the green light on those designs.
Well, the politics of it are really confusing because they're, Serge designed the stuff in the 70s, and then, I don't know what year, 82, something like that, he decided that he wasn't into doing it anymore, and that his new passion was to help Ukrainian Jewish refugees find asylum in other countries, or something like that. So he was totally out of the synth world for 25 years or something, and the Surge Modular was still made by STS for all those years and still being made now. But then in the late 90s, or maybe about 15 years ago, these circuits started to show up in various places in varying degrees of actually telling point blank that they were the Surge circuits. So now there are multiple companies that claim that they're licensed from Surge, so I don't know if he's just granting permission to anyone who asks, or if some people have the rights and some don't, or what's going on. But the circuits are cool. I think that there's a big benefit to those original panel designs or the original layouts. I think that that's a really big part of any synthesizer, is the way that the interface is configured is a big part of the feel of what that is. So I guess if there's only one version of it that looks the same or feels the same, then that's the one that's the most like the real thing, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, I've heard you sort of talk about that in the past, that how you, with your designs, you start with like the interface first and then work backwards from there. I think that's really interesting, because I'm from that kind of, industrial design background myself and things. And I think that's really, like, let's make it happen from the user perspective backwards, rather than I've got this kind of really super nerdy idea, but it just looks like a mess at the end, and can't be used.
Well, that's the problem, is you might end up with something that seems like a piece of lab equipment if you have a circuit that does what you want, and then say, okay, well, let's put an interface on this. So it's 8 knobs and 11 jacks. So just line them up in a grid and call it a finished module. It doesn't make for musical interfaces.
Just to bring it back to something else we spoke about, because I've just been thinking, how can I patch this? You said in the Buchla 265 that it was a triangle wave synced to the noise.
Right.
What sort of rate triangle wave, and just pure white noise it was synced to? So
yeah. So the way that it works is, well, I mean, hard sync means that if you imagine in an oscillator, there's a comparator which is resetting the oscillator to start the cycle again. Yeah. And hard sync is just an external signal going to that comparator and saying, reset now, no matter what.
That gives us all those like sync lead type sounds where you sweep the pitch of a different.
Right. But if you do that, then you create the sync with a noise signal. Then whenever the noise is above the threshold for the reset, then the VCO, or the not voltage controlled oscillator, just oscillator, it resets every time that the noise is at that threshold. And then it has to be tuned so that it's not resetting more often than it would have. Otherwise, then the range.
Yeah, because that's what I was thinking. What sort of range was the triangle wave at? Because you run the risk, if it's too low, of just getting the bottom of the triangle all the time.
Yeah. The cool thing about that system is that it allows you to really tune the range that the voltage is coming out of the sample and hold will be, because whatever the range of that triangle is, that's your entire range of voltages. So in that context, that old Buchla standard at that time, the CVs were 0 to 15 volts. So that's not like a practical level for, particularly not for a Eurorack system where the power rail is only 12 volts.
Yeah.
But for instance, you could use if you have some oscillator, and it doesn't really matter if it's for this purpose, it doesn't matter if it's triangle or saw. But if you have a VCO that has a sync input, you could try syncing it to noise and then using its output as your source for your sample and hold, and you should get a more even distribution across the range than you would using the noise itself.
Definitely going to try it. That's what I was after, just thinking how can I do it? So yeah.
That's the challenge.
We'll try that and report back afterwards.
Yeah.
So just to close up, anything anyone wants to link, promo, things to check out, we'll get links to Mark's website in the description, on screen, modularpodcast.com for us. We said last show we were going to give away a t-shirt. We're going to stop this filming and not waste everyone's time, and I'm going to put names in the hat. I'll film that and we'll give away a t-shirt that'll tag on the end of this video. Anything from anyone else?
No, that's it.
Be random.
Random overload yet, Matthew, or just the start?
No, never. No.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mark. A lot of history in there and ideas. Really appreciate it.
Really, really, really interesting.
Good, Mark. Really enjoyed it.
And yeah,
thanks for inviting me, guys. This was really cool.
Yeah, well, hopefully have you on in the future, either for another topic or more of a straight-up interview or something. Certainly a lot to get from it. I think we've all learned a lot, and I'm certainly going to, as soon as we stop, try syncing a triangle wave to noise.
I'm going to do that right now.
So yeah, thank you very much, and we'll see everyone next time.